Hey guys, this is chapter 37, Ecology for Ecosystems. And so we just have this chapter and the next one, and then we're done. And this should all be a review from 10th grade biology. So we're looking here at this ecosystem level of ecology, and this is where we're looking at living things and non-living things together. And we see here some examples of different ecosystems. We have the rainforest in Brazil, and a tide pool would be an example of an ecosystem, a desert. So those are some different ecosystems, and if we have a large enough one, we would characterize it as a biome. So here's some different types. We have deserts, the Saguaro National Park in Arizona, which I grew up near, and then we have this Cape Verde in Africa, and so this is devoid of plant life, which is interesting too, but also has other living things, of course. And so we're looking at, when we look at ecosystems, we look for equilibrium, and we look to see if they have resilience, if they can recover after a disturbance, and if they have resistance to their equilibrium changing during a disturbance. And so we can think about this in terms of the human population with COVID-19, and even with our economy. We can think of the economy as an ecosystem as well. And if we're able to withstand this disruption, and if we have the resilience to bounce back. And this is really important with living things, with living ecosystems, in terms of human impact and how our human impact can influence them and how resilient they are and how well they can bounce back and kind of stabilize themselves. We also learn about food webs and food chains. A food chain is really simple and one-dimensional, so it's just starting with like the primary producer to the primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary, quaternary, etc., and then decomposers. A food web is a lot more complex. You see a lot more of these connections between organisms in a food web. And then we also learned about trophic levels. So this is showing that same idea of the food chain or food web, but it's showing it leveled up. And as we move up from like the producers to the primary consumers, you're gonna get a 90% loss in energy. So this isn't really to scale, but each time you move up, you're gonna have 90% less calories. So only 10% of the calories are transferred as you move up to each level. And that is lost through heat and also through decomposers breaking down dead materials and waste. And so that's really important as we look at how many like primary producers we need to actually support that top consumer, that top one of the food chain. Here's another look at those trophic levels. So we can see that the primary producers at the bottom, this is an aquatic ecosystem, so it doesn't always have to be grass. It can be like algae or phytoplankton. And then as we move up, you have higher and higher level organisms. And here is showing that 90% loss of energy or calories or even numbers. So every time you move up one trophic level, you're losing 90% of those, either biomass, number of organisms, energy, and you can see that loss here every time you move up. So here is another look at some trophic levels. In this aquatic ecosystem here at the bottom, you have a bunch of algae. And then the next primary consumer level, you have all these different types of organisms. You have some macroinvertebrates, which are like insects that are aquatic invertebrates, and some other organisms. And then you move up to the fish level. Here's the opossum shrimp. If you remember that from the Flathead Lake study, they thought that the opossum shrimp were actually primary consumers, and they ended up being secondary consumers and eating all the prey food, and they crashed the food web. They were introduced into Flathead Lake. And then you have all these higher level fish, and then eventually at the top, maybe an eagle or a top consumer. And this is showing a pyramid of numbers again, but this is upside down from what we've seen. So here at the top, we've got our sunlight feeding our primary producers, and we're showing some numbers here and how many organisms that supports at each of the subsequent levels, and we're dropping by an order of magnitude every time, by 10 times. All right, so let's look more into this energy flow through ecosystems in section 2. These are some ways that organisms can get energy through photosynthesis, chemosynthesis. They can eat things like we do from cell respiration, and those are pretty much the 3 ways that we get energy for sure. So photosynthesis is using light to get energy. Chemosynthesis is using chemicals to get energy. That happens where there's no light. Chemoautotrophs exist at the bottom of the ocean. So these are some, they're showing like vent mussels at a hydrothermal vent. And it's important to note that they're not using the heat for energy, but they're actually using chemicals down there. That's a common misconception. And we can see some of this productivity. So in this first, in Silver Springs, Florida, this first box here, you can see the plants have 809, and then the other ones have way less numbers, much smaller numbers. The English Channel here is kind of backwards. This pyramid looks a little different in terms of biomass. So the phytoplankton are going to weigh less than the zooplankton to support them, which is interesting. Here in a grassland, you're going to have tons of grass to support some primary consumers, and then even fewer as you go up. So you're losing a lot of numbers. Temperate forest in the summer, 200 trees. So not very many trees, but they're able to support 150,000 insects, and then it gets less as you go up. So they can only support 5 birds. Silver Springs, Florida, we're looking at plants here in terms of energy instead of biomass, which is up here. And so we still see that we're getting way less as we move up. So there's different ways to look at, we can look at energy, we can look at numbers, we can look at biomass for sure. And another thing that we see in food webs and food chains is when you have like a toxin, like in this case PCB, then let's like say it starts with the phytoplankton and each of these are eating each other, eventually you're going to have really high levels of the toxin as you go up. This happens with mercury in fish, which is why we're told not to eat like swordfish and some of those top predator fish, because they have biomagnification of mercury. And so that can be a big problem in aquatic ecosystems and terrestrial ecosystems. So here's that picture of swordfish and mercury. They recommend that like pregnant women and young children don't eat it because you can get a lot of mercury. And if you eat a lot of it, you're like the very, very top consumer and you'll eventually get a lot of mercury. All right, so section 3 here is the biogeochemical cycle. And if we break that word down, bio means living thing. Geo is rocks, and then chemical is chemicals. And so we're looking at how nutrients, some of these chemicals, cycle through living things and cycle through non-living things. So here's water. Water is one nutrient that cycles. Most of our water, as you know, is tied up in salt water, and then a very small sliver of it is fresh water. And if we broke down that freshwater sliver, only 0.3 is lakes and rivers, 30.8% is groundwater, which we would use here. And then glaciers and permanent snow covers the rest. So really very small fraction of the water on Earth is available for drinking. And you can see here how long water molecules spend in different places. So they spend a lot of time in glaciers, a lot of time in groundwater, and lots of times in oceans. And they spend a lot less time in living things up here at the top, biospheric, that's in living things. And this is the water cycle. You've learned this. This is pretty easy. So we can see how the water cycle can spend some time in living things and it can spend some time in non-living things and in the atmosphere. The carbon cycle is another biogeochemical cycle that we look at. Same thing here. We see that it spends some time in the air, sometime in the ocean, sometime in the ground, and sometime in living things, and it cycles through that. And it spends different amounts of time in each. So this is what happens in one of those cycles. This is going from the air to water, and it can actually dissolve in water and become carbonic acid. So when we have CO2 in water, like in pop, it becomes carbonic acid, becomes acidic, and then it can also come out of the water. So that's another cycle that we see with the carbon cycle. The nitrogen cycle, again, another cycle. It spends some time in the air as N2, and then it can also be changed into like NO3 nitrates that are used in living things, into rocks, into water. It can also spend some time in different places. And then the phosphorus cycle, same thing. We see those nutrients. So we have water, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus. Those are the main ones. And those are things that we use for fertilizer too, right? So fertilizers are pretty common all over the world, and they can cause a lot of problems. We need to use them well. They can cause overgrowth of organisms like in water, and they can cause undergrowth too. And then that can throw off the whole food web. So we need to make sure that we're using them well. They can also be toxic to organisms as well. So this is a photo of the Chesapeake Bay. And it looks like they had runoff of phosphate and nitrate, and that caused the Army Corps of Engineers had to come in and help restore the oysters in that area because the fertilizer affected them. Sulfur cycle is another one. So you can see same thing here that we see sulfurs moving through the atmosphere. Human emissions, acid rain can actually be from sulfur, from sulfuric acid, but it can spend some time in rocks and in living things as well. This is a sulfur vent from Lassen Volcanic Park in California. We have also some sulfur activity at Yellowstone as well. All right, so that is chapter 37.